All right, we'll get started here in just a minute. Give folks a chance to get into the webinar here. I think we
Shall
can
we
probably get started. Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay, today we'll be talking about transitioning beef cattle and broilers to certified organic. And it'll be presented by Nick and I. I'm Samantha Hilborn-Nalawai. I'm the Southwest Organic Consultant, and I'm based out of Espanola, New Mexico, which is in northern New Mexico. And my experience with beef cattle is just helping around with cow-calf operations around New Mexico when I can, when I could growing up. But most of my background's in plant breeding and vegetable and orchard production. And I'll let Nick introduce himself.
My name is Nick Podall. I'm also an organic consultant with the Institute, and I'm located in Minnesota. I grew up on an organic farm, and we had a certified organic turkey flock on the farm for a number of years when I was growing up. So I'll be talking mostly about some of the poultry stuff today. I also work in vegetable and grain production as well. So.
Let's see, our agenda for today is to talk a little bit about Rodeo Institute, some certifier basics behind that certification, and then the basics of organic beef and poultry production. So like Nick said, I'll be doing most of the beef and he'll do most of the poultry production. And we'll kind of have a little bit of discussion around challenges and benefits of those, and then talk about consulting services. So Rodeo Institute, we work for a 501c3 nonprofit focused on organic agricultural research, training, and education. And then main campus is based in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. But we have regional resource centers in Georgia, Iowa, California, and Washington, in addition to the one in Pennsylvania. And then we also have our consultants, which are Sam, me, Nick, and all the other consultants that are stars across the country. And I really like this quote that says, what we do, so our mission. So we aim to expand organic agriculture by assisting farmers in successfully transitioning to organic, conducting research on organic farming methods and their impact, and thirdly, educating consumers on the benefits of organic for people and the planet. So what is organic production? I really like the NOP has come out with their definition of it, and I really enjoy reading it every time. So organic production is a production system that is managed to respond to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. And the labels, so the USDA labels that you see on the screen, it's protected and regulated by the USDA. And certified organic farms are inspected on an annual basis. So if you're transitioning, you'll do a inspection each year.
So the steps to get certified, the thing to do kind of first is to identify a certification agency that you would like to work with. And you can usually work with any across the country, but it's easiest to work with one that's within your region. So when they send an inspector out, it's easy for them and cost effective for them, for that inspector to get to your farm. And that will in turn cost you a little less money for the certification process then as well. But once you've chosen a certifier, you complete an application with that agency. You fill out what's called an organic systems plan and submit to the agency for review. This tells the certifier all the plans for your operation, how you plan to produce the products that you are going to be selling as organic. And you have to have production plans, but also plans for record keeping and other ecosystem services that you plan to provide as part of your farm for wildlife and protection of other natural resources as well. Once that's been submitted and reviewed, and you've gone through the transition process, there's an on-site inspection, and that's when the certifier sends out an inspector to your farm, and they basically verify that everything that's in your organic systems plan is actually what's happening on your farm. Then there's an evaluation of that inspection report that the inspector submits back to the certifier, and then they make their certification decision to certify your farm. And it's not a process that you necessarily have to be worried about or scared of. These certifiers want to see farms transition to organic, and while they are tasked with upholding the standards and making sure that there is compliance to those standards, they're not as heavy-handed as people would think that they would be. They do have to, abide by certain rules, but again, they want to see farmers successful, so they help as much as they can. There is a limit to how much they can help, though, because of a conflict of interest, essentially. And so that's when working with a consulting group like ours that can help you fill out all these plans and make decisions about your production system as you're going through this process is helpful. All right, next slide. So the costs associated with the certifier typically range between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. It's somewhere in that range. Different certifiers have different costs. And it also depends a little bit on how you go through the transition process. There are some certifiers that offer for a little extra fee. You can work with them earlier in the transition and submit all your records and get feedback on those things as you go through transition, so that your paperwork is all set up and they know you and know your farm usually well before the inspection happens. So some certifiers will do that and work with farmers, and they do charge a little bit of an administrative fee on top of the certification cost to do that, but it can be helpful. There are reimbursements for certification costs. So there's an organic cost share program through the USDA, NRCS. There's a reimbursement now of up to 75% or $750 of your certification costs through that program. And that's an increase from 50% or $500. That's a new increase for 2023. And then there's also the new program of the Organic and Transition Education and Certification Program. And that's a reimbursement of 25% or up to $250. And those reimbursements for 2023 are now stackable. So you can get a pretty significant part of your certification costs taken care of, if not all of them at this point. So it is a good time to start that process. All right, next slide. As I said, there are lots of different agencies that you can work with to become certified, and trying to pick one in your region is usually one of the best. There are some nationwide or even international services that have inspectors in different parts of the country or even in the world, and there are a few companies like that. OneCert is one of them, but many of the other ones are SCS is another one, but many of the others are kind of regional. And sometimes the advantage to the regional one is that they have inspectors and staff that have worked in organic agriculture in the region that you're in, and you're maybe more assured of working with someone who probably might understand your farm and your operation a little bit better, which can be an advantage. So there are, like I said, different ones in different regions. There's CCOF in California, OCIA is in Nebraska. Where Food Comes From is now out of Colorado, but they have a branch in North Dakota because they bought ICS, which used to be based in North Dakota. So there are some options out there. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but when you work with us as consultants as well, we can help you get in contact with any of these certification agencies and help get that process started. So, all right, next slide.
Okay. So we're gonna head into the basics of beef and poultry. I like to start with the origin of livestock role for beef, especially. So when I talk to cow-calf operations, that's like what I like to start with. So what is the origin of livestock role? So it's this first paragraph. So livestock products that are sold, labeled, or represented as organic must be from livestock under continuous organic management from the last third of gestation. And this is specifically for beef operations or ruminants. So when I'm talking to cow-calf operations, your cows are your breeder stock. They're not organic, but they produce organic calves. So looking at the livestock rule, they have to be managed organically from the last third of gestation and their lactating period. So when they're with the calves, and that's when they're managed organically. And then the small window between weaning and the next breeding cycle, you can give them conventional feed, you can give them certain things because they're not organic. And then the calves that come from these cows are to be sold organically. So they must be managed from the last third of their gestation. If you're getting steers, you know, you don't want to deal with cows and breeding. If you get steers, they have to come from cows that are managed organically from their last third of gestation. So you have to get cows or get your steers or cows from an organic operation. And then conventional bulls are used all the time. There's no such thing as an organic bull that's used for breeding.
And then talking about poultry, it's different rules, whole different animal. So the chicks do not have to be hatched from an organic flock. But in order to sell eggs or meat as certified organic, birds must be managed organically from the second day after hatching. So they can come from an organic flock, but as long as they're managed organically from the second day after hatching, if they're from a conventional flock, that is, or from a conventional hatchery, that is okay. Organic poultry, however, do lose their organic status if they're ever removed from organic management after that second day. If they're treated with for an illness with a prohibited substance, for instance, they would have to be moved out of organic production, and they cannot be rotated or transitioned back into it. All right, next slide.
Okay. Moving into more basic requirements for beef / ruminants. The pasture roll is really important. Cattle have to have 30%, at least 30% of their dry matter intake from grazing throughout the grazing season. And as a farmer or rancher, you'll identify what is your grazing season. You can spell that out. And so the grazing season has to be at least 120 days per year. And it doesn't have to be a continuous 120 days. So we want to meet that 120 days per year with some buffer on each side in the spring or in the fall. And then the feed program in non-grazing time or when you're supplementing throughout the grazing season, feed needs to be certified organic. There are supplements such as the salt block, things like that. Supplements need to be naturally derived. And for healthcare, the materials allowed are vaccinations, homemade remedies, fly controls, certain dewormers. The absolute no-go, one thing you cannot have is antibiotic usage. So they're trying to get away from prophylactic use of antibiotics and only using when it's needed. So that's why antibiotic usage is not allowed versus the conventional side that it is prophylactically used. Living conditions are emphasized. A big emphasis is on living conditions. We need to have clean water, shade in adverse weather. Your inspector is going to be looking at all of that. What kind of conditions are your cows living in?
So just to piggyback off the beef for just a minute, some of those living conditions, on the beef side, they do have to have access to outdoors all the time as well. And so your inspector will be looking at and any areas where they're outside need to be clean and relatively clean and have some vegetation present. If they're in like confined in like a muddy feedlot type situation, that's not something that we want to see in organic systems. So when they are outside, we do want them to be on vegetation that they can graze on. So that's important distinction just to make there. And then again, touching on that pasture rule, when your inspector comes and they will look at how much feed that you have ordered and fed during the year, and that will be required to be kept as part of your record keeping. And they'll look at your grazing season that you have specified, and they will do the math calculation to figure out if you have indeed had 30% of your herd's dry matter intake from grazing. So I think a lot of producers maybe look at that and think, well, if I get close, I'm okay. But they are, it's very specific in the rule. And so the certification agencies are sticklers about that one. If it's 29.8% by their calculations, they're gonna ding you for that. And it's not that you'd lose certification, but they will say that the next year you need to, they'll note that in your inspection, and they will say that the next year that needs to be something you need to meet. So again, they wouldn't decertify you because you're still doing organic practices. You're just not meeting, you just wouldn't be meeting all of the requirements. So again, they want farmers to be successful. They give you a chance to remedy that. As long as you haven't done anything that would move those cattle out of organic production, like applying a prohibited substance as a pour-on, for instance, or giving antibiotics and still having them in your organic herd. Those are things that would disqualify, and they would have to pull certifications for those types of things. But as long as you're still following organic practices, if you don't meet some of these rules, it's just a requirement that you need to improve upon. So just wanted to make that point real quick. And then I'll move into the poultry here.
Yeah, we can help you calculate your dry matter intake for grazing.
Right, that's another thing that we do as consultants to make sure that you have that in your organic system plan and that you have a plan in place to meet that for sure. All right, so basic management for poultry. All the organic components of the feed ration must be 100% organic. In poultry production, there is only one synthetic feed additive that is allowed, and that is methionine. It's just not something that is, it's a required substance that poultry need to have in their feed. And so they can't get it, they can't get enough in just their feed in order to supply what they need in a production system. And so it is something that the National Organic Program has recognized, and so they do allow that. There's maximum rates for it. It's 2 pounds per ton of feed for chickens, either broilers or layers, and then it's 3 pounds per ton for turkey and all other poultry. Birds must also have access to the outdoors, just like all livestock and organic production. But for poultry, nutrition from pasture is not required like it is in beef. Since grasses and pasture really don't provide much nutrition for poultry as far as growing meat and producing eggs. It is healthy for them. They do, get some They do get some health benefits from being outside and on pasture, of course, but as far as growing meat and eggs, they don't gain much from that. So there is no nutritional requirement. However, the space that they're in outdoors has to be conducive to maintaining good flock health. So again, relatively clean, not muddy. And I'll get into this a little bit more when I go into living conditions later, but it does need to have some vegetation as well. And there's a specific requirement around that. You must establish preventative health management practices in your flock. Again, there's no antibiotics allowed in production, so no growth hormones, genetic engineering, cloning, any of those types of things that are prohibited in organics. And so prevention is sort of the order of the day. However, sick animals or more likely whole flocks in poultry production must be treated. You can't withhold treatment in order to maintain organic status. So we do still care about the health of the animals, and just as we treat ourselves with certain medications when we are sick, we expect that to be done with livestock as well. But then those birds are just not eligible to be sold as organic meat. And so that's the difference there. But so the birds that are treated with a prohibited substance must not be processed or sold as organic. All slaughter plants and handling facilities that process organic poultry and eggs must also be certified. So in addition to certifying your farm and your flock, the place where you for meat birds and for handling eggs, the places where you sell those must also be, or get them processed, must also be certified organic. So need to work with a certified organic slaughter plant. And then of course we have to keep good records to maintain organic integrity. That has to be protected by preventing organic birds and poultry products such as eggs and meat from coming into contact with any prohibited substances or being commingled with non-organic products. So we always want to keep those things separate, so there isn't a conventional product that's entering the organic supply chain. All right, next slide.
Okay. So when you're thinking about your animals becoming certified organic, and you've heard about access to the outdoors and grazing, so we're gonna have to have land that needs to be certified organic too. So you will have the crop scope for the land, and then you'll have your livestock scope. So what needs to happen on the land? So the land, the pasture, the rangeland has to be managed organically for 3 years prior to certification eligibility. So this means no prohibited substances, such as glyphosate, synthetic fertilizers, things like that. Where I'm at in the Southwest, we have a lot of instances where people have applied a prohibited substance 5 years ago, or they haven't applied anything for the last 3 years. So they're in a boat where they could get certified this year. Given everything else is ready, they could become certified this year.
And sometimes in a situation where you've just acquired some land as well, you could also be eligible for certification in that first year if you can get a statement from the previous owner that says that they haven't applied a prohibited substance within the last 3 years. So even when land changes ownership, that there is a possibility there. But you do, and most certifiers have a form, an affidavit that you can that either you can sign or you can give to the previous owner to sign if they're willing, that says that. So
I wanted to add one more thing, for grazing in particular. You can custom graze on other people's land as long as it is certified organic land. So if you have you can extend your grazing season that way by having the option to custom graze another someone else's land. For animal identification, you probably and already do this, but need to have their identity preserved and recorded. This goes with the record keeping. When you have a tagged individual or animal or a flock, keeping records of that is important. So Nick will talk a little bit about that, about birth date, records of when it was tagged, feed it's getting, things like that. So for beef cattle, commonly we use ear tags for individual identification. And then they're also freeze branded to tell who it is owned by or what ranch it belongs to.
and for poultry, it's sort of impractical to individually identify animals like we do in beef cattle or other ruminant livestock. We have what a flock ID is used, and in your records you'll have a hatching date and when those birds got to your farm, and to keep a record of to prove that those birds were managed organically again from that second day after hatching. And then just in case of a poultry flock of birds that gets sick, or individual animals get sick in poultry, because the animals aren't individually identified, at least initially. If it's a smaller flock and you treat an individual bird for an illness, that it will need to be, good management practice would be to isolate that bird from the rest of the flock anyway, while it's ill. But then it should be fed and finished elsewhere as conventional, and probably given a leg band to identify it from the rest of the flock, of the larger flock. In large poultry operations especially, this is not really like economical or practical to do that with individual birds. Like I said earlier, most of the time with large poultry flocks, if multiple birds get sick within a flock, they basically consider the entire flock sick, and you treat the whole flock for something. And so in that case, that whole entire flock is typically used or moved over to conventional. They would be out of organic certification. If you do see sick birds in an organic flock, again, especially in the larger ones, rather than necessarily treating the entire flock for something before you have to, if you notice individual sick birds, usually those are simply culled from the flock to prevent those things from spreading to the rest of the flock, and hopefully not losing your certification for the entire flock.
And for cattle, it's somewhat similar. So they're, you treat that animal, that individual animal, isolated from the rest And then they will be given a, I think the easiest is to be given a different color from the organic eligible calves or steers. So you can easily go out, and the inspector can go out and look at your herd and say, okay, those ones are not organic eligible and these ones are. And the ones that have been treated and have a different color tag, they're just going to be part of the conventional supply chain. So in both instances, I think it's really important to say you want to have healthy animals, start out with healthy animals, a healthy herd, healthy flock, because you don't want to, if you're getting the premium, you don't want to have to just have them go part of the, be part of the conventional supply chain.
All right, living conditions for poultry. Again, this is similar to any other livestock and organic production, but it must accommodate the health and natural behavior of the animals. So they have to be given year-round access to the outdoors. In the cases of like layer birds, they're often it's taken to the point where they also need to have areas to perch inside so that they can again follow their natural behavior, so they can roost at night and things like that. But one of the most important things in organic poultry production for compliance is that the birds have to be stocked in appropriate densities. So these densities vary by the species of poultry and the size of the bird, but they're meant to provide enough space for the bird to move around, and again accommodate that natural behavior. Kind of a good rule of thumb in order to meet most of the requirements for any poultry is to have at least 2 square feet of indoor space per bird. They are allowed at a little bit lower density than that, depending on the size and of the bird and what its purpose is. If it's for meat or eggs, there's some difference in there, and this is something where we would of course help a producer figure out exactly how much, but if you were constructing a barn, for instance, about 2 square feet per bird, that is something that you could plan on I think for construction as a general rule of thumb. The indoor space has to maintain proper air temperature, air circulation, and air quality, specifically with ammonia concentrations. Again, there are certain numbers. They will actually measure the concentration of ammonia in the air, and inspectors will be watching for those types of things when they do come inspect a poultry operation. And again, those are standards for the indoor space. The requirement for the area of outdoor space that must also be provided also does vary by species and size, so it has to meet sort of that stocking rate as well. They need to have enough room to move around outside as well, and it's calculated as a percentage of the indoor space. So not all the birds are going to be outside all the time, and so depending on the bird, again, it's anywhere from 10 to 20% of the indoor space typically is what's going to be required for the outdoor space. The outdoor space must also be at least 50% soil based. So it can't all just be a concrete pad. There must be some soil base on the outdoor space, and then that soil has to be sufficiently covered by vegetation to protect it from erosion as well. So this is something that has to be maintained as a part of the operation. That sufficient vegetation cover is important. So in playing into this is the fact that birds can be confined for different periods of time, and they can be confined due to considerations such as stage of life. So when they're very young, most birds can be confined. For chickens, I think it's up to the first 16 weeks they can actually be inside, because that's when they're basically old enough to sort of fend for themselves in the outdoor space, and they're large enough and healthy enough to be able to handle that at that point. So there's also, in the case of inclement weather, most producers put birds in, of course, when you have rain events or anything like that, potentially in other types of weather situations as well. If it's, possibly extreme heat, if they've for some reason have, better ventilation inside the building. And then there's also that an exception given for risk to soil and water quality. So again, with the vegetation, the soil base area outdoors and the vegetation that has to be maintained there, birds can be confined in a building for a period of time for you to reestablish vegetation in that area. So that is a consideration that's given. And there's lots of other little rules with poultry to follow as far as confinement and stuff like that goes. Most producers put birds in at night as well, and move them out during the day so that the barn does not have to be open at night. Of course, you need to protect them from predators and things like that as well, and that is also a reason to keep them confined for a certain period of time. And again, they're not required to get any nutrition specifically off of their outdoor space, and so it's a little bit less strict, I would say, than it is for cattle because of that nutritional requirement for cattle. So again, birds can be confined for specific reasons. If there's other reasons, you can always contact your certifier, and certifiers will typically make decisions about that as needed as well. If things come up that require you to confine birds for a little bit more extended period of time for some reason. So always talk to your certifier about that. That's generally a good practice when you're doing some of these things, to make sure that you're keeping in step with the rules under the regulations. So all right, next slide.
When we talk about record keeping, there's a long list of things that maybe you already keep, but you might have to do some additional record keeping. So your organic system plan will contain everything that your certifier wants you to keep records of. This first one is more for beef records. So they want birth records, feed records, and veterinary records that are tied to that animal, or cow-calf pair. And then Nick, you want to talk about records?
Yeah, for poultry, it's it would be that the hatching date would be sort of like the birth record, and then again keeping track of the feed records to show that they were managed organically from that second day after hatching. Veterinary records would be sort of for the entire flock. But again, you are, if an entire flock does have to be treated for some reason because of a disease outbreak, that would move that flock into the conventional supply chain at that point. But you are required to keep records of any of those things. To prevent some of those things, we have certain feed additives and practices we use in their water systems and things like that. Those inputs do need to be kept track of as well. So, like for instance, iodine to use to keep the water systems clean, things like that. You have to keep track of how much of that is purchased as an input, and how much is used in the over the course of the season that you have the flock. So it's important to keep track of any inputs essentially to your flock or your herd, and how those things are being fed or applied. You should also keep for the outdoor spaces, either for poultry or of course for livestock, beef, maps of the fields. This is all going to be in your OSP, but the boundaries, any buffers that you may need in order to maintain certification of that land base, that outdoor space. If it butts up against some adjacent conventional land, you may need a buffer to maintain that. And those are decisions that your certifier will make as well with you, and you will have records of those.
Again, buffers. Buffers for the cows. Cows always reach through the fence, so making sure you're not, spraying, or the county or whatnot, your neighbor isn't spraying outside of the fence, because they're always going to reach through the fence.
Yes. So yeah, along with that, any kind of weed, pest, disease management that's done on the vegetation of that land needs to be, again, in practice, keeping with organic practices in order to maintain that certification, and records need to be kept of all those inputs as well. For poultry, maintaining the vegetation on their outdoor space, your seed inputs for that would have to be seed and fertilizer would have to be organic, and so you need to keep track of those things as a part of your operation as well. And then of course I mentioned the biodiversity piece of it. It's required on organic farms to promote biodiversity, and so conservation, any conservation practices that you have to preserve water resources or promote biodiversity and wildlife habitat, you should keep track of those practices as well. And then another big one to mention would be keeping track of sales of animals. So any transactions that you have selling and processing the animals, those all need to be kept track of in your records as well. So for poultry flocks, birds, when they're loaded on the truck and taken to the slaughter facility, you need to have a record of the birds in your flock, and approximately how many are loaded, and then you get a final count of that from the slaughterhouse, so you know exactly how many birds were slaughtered and eventually sold. And you would have invoices and receipts for all of those things, and they would check in just to give an example of what the inspector would be checking on. They would look at how much feed that you purchased to feed a flock of the size that you had, And then they would check that against how many birds you actually slaughtered and sold. And so you always lose a few birds during the course of the year. So the amount of birds you got from the hatchery is definitely not going to be the number of birds that you actually end up slaughtering. There's going to be less. So they're kind of looking for that, and then to verify that the amount of feed that you purchased is an appropriate amount for that size of flock. And then the amount of birds that were actually sold as organic matches the size of the flock that you had on your farm. Those are the kinds of things that our inspectors do math on to verify. So that's why it's important to keep records of all of those things, because if they can't verify it, then they have to report that back to the certifier, and that would be a non-compliance that you would have to then be sure to remedy the very next year. So
And just one more note about record keeping and organic system plans. Don't be intimidated by it. I like to give an example of what does it look like on an example OSP. I believe this is pasture management from Oregon Tilth. Yes to no explanations of your management. They want to see what you're doing. It's not a blank sheet where you fill in everything that you're doing. So starting in grazing, your pasture maps, and describe your grazing season, things like that. And these records are to help you unintentionally help you farm and ranch better. It's helping you see what's working and what's not.
right, even the best conventional producers are going to be keeping track of a lot of these things. If you are managing your farm properly and you're careful about managing the finances on your farm, you're going to be keeping track of all of these inputs anyway, or at least you should be. And so it is a requirement in organic production, yes, but again, it's not meant to be burdensome. It should actually help you operate a better run farm or ranch. So
these next two slides are just going to be a little bit, we'll do like a quick run through of where you may get the potential for an organic premium in your marketing or distribution. So I'll talk more about beef and Nick will do the poultry. So I think for both uses, for beef and poultry or broilers, home use or homestead use, you're not going to see an organic premium just because you're using it on your farm. But I know quite a few people that do keep a portion use for themselves. The direct to consumer brand, so examples of that are the farm store, farm market, and internet sales. Sorry. You may see an organic premium there, especially on internet sales, if you're able to market your story and your what you're doing to be certified organic.
I think for on the poultry side of things, on those first two, like homestead, of course, you're not necessarily similar to beef. You're not necessarily going to see like a premium there. If you have a kind of a direct to consumer brand, you may see one, but this would be more of a smaller poultry operation. You know, typically maybe something where it's not more than a few thousand birds or something like that. It may even be smaller than, I think it's 1,000 birds under USDA rules. Don't necessarily have to have like inspected facilities and stuff like that. But as part of your organic certification, you would have to have some, if you had a slaughter facility on your farm, that would have to be inspected underneath your organic program. But you can potentially be competing against some other conventional poultry operations of around the same size, and you're still kind of in that farm raised, you know, naturally raised kind of market where certified organic may or may not give you too much of an advantage in some of those smaller regional or local markets like that.
Moving on to wholesale partnerships. This includes restaurants, school districts, which is can also mean school to farm to institution, or the local grocery chain. In my experience, most restaurants, they may or may not give you that premium, more likely not. School districts or school to institution, in New Mexico, they're doing more value chain incentives where you do get that premium for organic produce. So, but that's not the case everywhere. So again, that's a state by state issue, whether you may get that premium. And in your local grocery chain, you may see more. And I'll just say overall, over all of these in beef production, we're butting up against whether consumers want grass-fed beef or they want organic. So people may just accept the grass-fed beef. You know, a restaurant may just want grass-fed beef and they don't care about the organic certification. So that's kind of the push and pull of the beef market, what consumers or chefs or whoever's buying your meat wants.
And on the poultry side of things, again, it's a somewhat similar story where in the poultry market, butting up against the natural distinction or even pasture raised poultry, but not necessarily certified organic. And so you're kind of competing in some of that same kind of space. And so restaurants and school districts, certain types of restaurants, maybe if they have a specific desire for organic, may give you that. School districts potentially, but maybe not. Grocery chains can be a good outlet, like any kind of natural grocer. There can be chains of those in regions. You know, even if they sell both, they might sell not all certified organic and maybe a natural grocer, but there may be a good market for those in those types of stores. When my family produced organic turkeys, we ship slaughtered birds to lots of different natural grocers around the country, and that was a good outlet for our birds at the time. So.
And lastly, we have our grower partner markets. So we have subscription companies, a producer group. I would also loop that into a co-op. So if you're in a meat co-op of 5 or 10 different growers that make up a cooperative. And here, I think for beef, you would definitely see the price premium, because these companies have already built in, they have a solid market for organic beef, and they need growers. So I'm seeing that a lot in the Western US. They're looking for organic beef growers, to sell their steers to them. Same with the co-op. That the co-op also gives you better marketing. When I'm talking to a lot of smaller 50 head less of cattle, not everyone has to fill up a truck. They can take 5, 10, 15 cows, and they can fill up a truck, and that goes to a company that goes to the slaughterhouse facility, and that makes it worth their time.
Yeah, and on the poultry side, there's been a lot of talk about, some of these bigger companies that have individual farmers growing for them, especially on the conventional side, and some of those practices not being very fair to the farmer on the conventional side compared to the benefit that the company is getting. So you had thinking your bigger companies like Tyson and some of those, but on the organic side, there are some large organic poultry production facilities that to my understanding, they're mostly all sort of in-house facilities, and they're not licensed out to like individual growers on the poultry side so far. But and if you were to, some of these companies would be competing against the Purdue and Bell and Evans of the world. So you would be up against some significant competition in the organic industry already. But there are big markets for organic poultry out there, and there are some pretty large companies that are taking advantage of that at this point. So potentially, there may be some producer groups out there for poultry, at least regionally, that you might be able to get hooked in with. So.
So this ties into, so the marketing ties into the challenges and benefits. So we just went over, your market. So if you find the right market, it's also a challenge and a benefit in both industries, especially for beef. I don't know about, probably for birds it's easier, but for beef, the processing facilities in the Western US, probably less so in the Eastern US. Organic processing facilities is something that we're lacking in. So that's a slowdown for beef producers.
Yeah, I would say generally that's probably a concern for poultry producers, although it's probably, like you said, a little bit better than the beef side. There is a greater market, I think, for organic poultry at this point. So there are facilities in most states that are certified to handle organic birds. The biggest bottleneck there is potentially the size of that facility, what capacity, a number of birds they could handle, and how much capacity they might have to handle another operation if you were starting one. And so you have those types of concerns, I think, are the biggest thing, rather than maybe just finding one. It's finding one that's able to accommodate your operation. Yeah, other than that, I think, some of the other challenges are all are all pretty similar there across the board, but generally, I think the other things that are listed there can be overcome. But
Right. Yeah, we've discussed, yeah, the different certifications, grass-fed for beef, and then naturally grown. If you sell under $5,000 worth of organic, say have under $5,000 of organic sales, you don't have to be certified organic. And then the cost of certification is sometimes a challenge for farmers, but there is the USDA reimbursement. So some benefits also, so we've gone over price premiums that are available. Maybe organic aligns with your values of how you should be growing or raising animals. So that's a better organics and alignment of your values. It also opens up a national market. Your meat can go into several different markets across the US. Some benefits also includes, you want to diversify your farm in terms of animals, you want to include animals into your farm. That's a form of diversification. And then diversification of plant species, forage for your animals. I'm thinking of cows again. And then you have improved herd health. Starting out with a healthy herd, but you have continuous herd health.
and I think one potential benefit to your total farm is under that diversification piece. If you have grain acres and you're raising feed to feed poultry, for poultry flocks specifically, the way it works out, the amount of acres that are required to grow feed to feed any size poultry flock, the amount of manure that's produced by that same size poultry flock is enough to fertilize the land again to grow feed. And so you have an opportunity with poultry flocks specifically to create a closed nutrient loop. And it can be a really great opportunity for an organic operation that is growing grains and poultry at the same time.
And lastly, we'll go into our consulting services. So I won't read out all of these, but this is a plethora of what we do. We have our on-farm consultations. Of course, we help you with your OSP, your organic system plan, help you with inspections. We can help you with your dry matter intake plan, your disease, pests and management plan, how you're going to change inputs. Maybe if you're conventional, maybe you have a one-to-one change input, or how are you going to increase grazing, things like that. And then we also have connections to markets, things like that.
Yeah, it's probably the most important piece outside of just the agronomic consultation is those marketing connections as well. We've got a marketing coordinator on staff as part of our consulting department to help farmers make those connections and have an outlet for their products. So.
And how does it work? Give us a call or email. We have the consulting website. You can email Nick or I. We'll have an introductory meeting where you go over your needs, your wants, what do you want to do, what do you aspire to do. We will schedule a time to come out to visit your farm, also called a site visit. And then we will stay in touch as you transition your farm. Since we're spread across the US, someone will be close enough to come visit. And that includes, in addition to the site visit, we're also have remote support as well.
And when you get to work with one of us, you really get to work with the whole team. Although you may be contacting, and meeting with one of us individually, we may pull in other consultants. We all have different specialties and interests and knowledge bases. And when you're working with us, you're really working with the whole team. And so if there's a piece that maybe another consultant in a different area has a little bit more experience in, we may bring them in for you to talk to as well. So lots of resources that we have at Rodeo Institute. Also access to education courses for producers through our education department, and then all of the research that we do at Rodeo as well. You also have access to all of that as part of our knowledge base. So,
and I'll have this. Contact us with a lot of funding coming down from the USDA and other organizations. Consulting is free in a number of states. So just contact us to see if it's free, or technical assistance is free.
Yeah, we do have some service available for free in different areas of the country. And so that's kind of on a case-by-case basis. But as far as questions, we've run plenty over time here, so we won't have time to answer questions live, but get a hold of us if you've got questions. We're always available to answer those individually. So be great to hear from any of you. And I think that's about all we have for today. So thank you for coming and attending. We hope you found it informative. And again, if you have any questions, just reach out and we will do our best to answer them. So thank you.
Thank you.